The topic of banking, and more specifically money, is something so essential to the commerce that supports our lives of Western luxury that is so frequently ignored. We spend decades of our lives slaving for something that we rarely understand. To further complicate matters, a strong degree of partisanship exists on the topic of money and banks. On the one hand, we have economists and Federal Reserve executives who praise the merits of the banks and monetary system with somewhat religious tones. On the other, we have those who would be considered conspiracy theorists by the modern media, who can only extol the evil that is the contemporary system of money and central banking. Such partisanship in science is increasingly common, as politics and the funding it provides becomes increasingly intertwined with that of the scientific community, which we often see in the field of climate studies, or more recently, that of pharmaceuticals and preventative medicine. The religious connotations that proponents of science extol in popular media is something highly dubious and should be regarded as very grave indeed by educated persons on both sides of the debate. As always, we cannot simply ignore one side in favor of the other. It is this philosophy that I adopt when explaining the arcane science of money and banking. For a long time, I was against the existence of privately held central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, and paper money without gold or silver standard. Alas, I did not know the financial history of the United States, nor the benefits and weaknesses of unrestrained banking and paper fiat currency in funding the rapid expansion of the United States in the frontier era. I will be explaining these in due course. My primary reference is that of John Kenneth Galbraith's book on money, From Whence It Came and Where It Went, published in 1965. I found this book to have a balanced perspective, more so than the economics textbooks, which can forget certain important details. I've also picked out some points from Bill Still's document, The Money Masters, Rise of the Bankers, which, although somewhat partisan in admonishment of banking, is an excellent brief history of banking that emphasizes the power that the issuance of money has on the health and wealth of a nation. That is available on YouTube for free. In 1968, a gift of $100,000 was received by one of Richard Nixon's good friends, a Charles Rebozo, from the eccentric millionaire Howard Hughes of aviator fame. Hughes had hoped these funds would assist in Nixon's election and buy him influence thereafter. The money was not used for election campaigning. Indeed, it was claimed to not have been used at all, and instead stored in a safe deposit box. When the notes were returned in March 1973, they had lost 20% of their value. 2 years later, each dollar was worth only 64 cents of the original 1968 sum. There was a general disbelief and embarrassment that Nixon and Rebozo could have been so indifferent to pecuniary concern. Indeed, they had even fallen below the biblical requirement for financial performance, as told in the parable of the talents. This episode demonstrated the recent shift in attitudes towards money. Everyone expects it to depreciate in value, something enabled by the relatively recent introduction of fiat currencies. Up until the 20th century, there was much uncertainty as to whether a man could get money, but little uncertainty as to what he could buy once he had it. Now, in the 20th century, the uncertainty of getting money has greatly diminished, replaced with a new uncertainty as to what money will be worth once accumulated. When money is bad, people want it to be better. When it is good, they forget about it. It is inflation that makes money bad, and the panic-inducing fear of inflation that inflation leaves in its wake that can be worse than the actual inflation itself. Looking at the past, we can begin to see how new institutions, corporations, trade unions, the welfare state have altered the problem of maintaining price stability. Consumerist class structures and shifting value systems have resulted in a populace demanding more than their forefathers, and the shifting political machinations of the rich, which have also greatly complicated the task of price stability. The aim of this essay is to examine the lessons of history, rather than history itself, on the subject of money, its origins and future. It was Adam Smith, a man only incrementally shy of religious reverence in the sphere of economics, that famously thought that the root of all evil was not money. When compared to all the alternative occupations which man gleefully conducted, whether war, politics, religion, or even sadism, money-making was seen to be the least of the worst. However, Smith did not doubt that the pursuit of money, and possession by greed, was capable of inducing bizarre and downright perverse behavior. The admiration and respect that is gained from accruing large sums of money often lead men to believe it is their own intrinsic features and wisdom that inspire such sentiments towards them. However, the rapid loss of money and accompanying flight of admiration that goes with it is always a form of low amusement. Money bemuses in another way. Many times over the centuries, men have supposed they have mastered the secret of its infinite amplification. As they have persuaded themselves of this, they easily persuade others. Invariably, it simply involves the rediscovery of some infinitely ancient fraud. The contemporary discussion of money holds a certain priestly or mystical air to it. Those who make their living talking about money gain a valuable prestige from engendering in their audience the belief that they are in a privileged association with the monetary occult, much like a witch doctor or soothsayer, and that their insights are far beyond the purview of the ordinary man. This is simply not true, and such a concept is a well-established phantom of fraudulence. We should take care to prevent any such illusion from clouding our minds. There is nothing about money that cannot be understood by any man of reasonable curiosity and intelligence. Just as the peddling of monetary mysticism is a well-established fraud, so too is the use of complexity to disguise the truth in the study of money and economics. Starting with the definition of money, one must ask, why does a specially stamped piece of paper have worth when similar pieces of paper do not? This is a common question asked by reporters when interviewing economic witch doctors of the contemporary variant. The audience should disregard complex and confusing definitions and remember that money is simply a common means for exchange when buying or selling goods and services with convenience. It is worth discussing the various forms of money throughout the ages in a cursory manner. For many thousands of years, from the Mycenaeans of ancient Greece up to the introduction of early paper promissory notes, gold, silver, and copper were the most notable materials of common exchange. Various other materials made brief and interesting appearances, including iron, tobacco, and even vertically split wooden staves known as English tally sticks. Predating metal currencies was the use of cattle, precious or semi-precious stones, and seashells, though these more awkward or easily replicated currencies were never used by any peoples other than primitives. Coins themselves were likely invented by the Lydians of ancient Anatolia, probably around 700 BC. It was for these coins that the women of Lydia prostituted themselves to procure their marriage dowry. The customs of the ancient Lydians shared notable similarity to the ancient Greeks, with the notable exception that prostitution was legitimized for purposes of marriage dowry, something that the Greeks did not participate in. With the introduction of coinage for convenient transaction arose some of the first forms of fraud in both public and private senses. For profligate, prodigal, or desperate rulers, gold and silver coins could be easily diluted with cheaper brass to purchase more goods or mercenaries with the hope that no one would immediately notice. To private traders, the opportunity presented to shave a small amount of metal off every precious coin that passed their sticky fingers. Polykratos was said to have cheated the Spartans with imitation gold coins as early as 540 BC. The Athenians appeared to understand the commercial and economic damage that a distrust of coinage would instill, and took honesty to be the best commercial policy. Upon the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Greek influence was reflected in Constantinople by the high purity of Byzantine currency, that of the Byzant, which was prized for centuries as the world symbol of reliable currency. This was in stark contrast to the Roman currency, which underwent dilution and steady debasement, thought to be in response, first, to the financial pressures of Hannibal and the Punic Wars, and continued thereafter. As time wore on, the currency became increasingly worthless. Surviving coinage from the reign of Aurelian in 270 AD showed a dismal silver content of 5%. This debasement of currency effectively converted the empire from a standard of gold and silver to that of copper. Good coinage was often hidden in hoards and lost, eventually ending up in the hands of modern-day collectors, with the debased currency left to circulate. It is commonly thought that the general collapse in faith of currency was a major contributing factor to the collapse of the Roman Empire. However, this form of historiography, the attachments of excessive consequential weight to activities which the observer disapproves, should be regarded with a high level of suspicion. When considering currency of the ancient and medieval world, especially in cities of international commerce, it should be noted that bad currency always drove out good, without exception. This is known as the Gresham effect. Currency with a good reputation for precious metal content was removed from circulation and retained, and the poor currencies passed on. Sir Thomas Gresham was the first to make this observation in 1558. While human nature is a largely invariant thing, some constants remain. When given the choice, people retain the best for those they love and pass on the rest. It was the dubious decision to accept coins on faith alone that drove the city of Amsterdam to weigh currency in 1609. It is this step that joined the history of money to the history of banking. However, we should first consider the event of a pervasively influential event that occurred some 100 years earlier, that of the Spanish conquest and development of Central and South America. The discovery of the New World and material riches it contained was indeed a poisoned chalice for the Spanish Empire, and indeed Greater Europe as a whole. In this case, it was not a dilution of currency with cheaper metals, but the sudden and massive influx of vast troves of hard currency which set off massive inflation and civil unrest. Up until the 1500s, Spain had been quite poor, more so than England or even France. Between 1500 and 1600, the effects of massive inflation were felt from Spain to England, France and Germany. The Spanish city of Andalusia saw average prices rise fivefold between 1500 and 1600. Between 1600 and 1680, prices rose by 350% in England before leveling off. It was the sudden inflation, not the stories of conquistadors and wonderful jungle cities, that informed the public that the New World had been discovered. The message from the Americas did not bring much joy. In Spain, a better understanding of where the influx of hard currency had come from led to wages more or less keeping up with commodity prices. In other parts of Europe, this did not occur, and wages often lagged far behind rising prices, possibly due to high levels of population growth and greater competition for work than in Spain. The share of a citizen's wage in currency or commodity would have also contributed to vulnerability to inflation. Those receiving income in the form of agricultural products would have found it easier to keep pace with inflation than those who worked for periodically set wages. In England, from 1673 to 1682, prices had rose 350% from 1500, while wages had only risen 200%. In this case, inflation had a profound effect on wealth inequality, especially for the poorest. Those who lost out and devalued wages enriched those who paid the wages, boosting profits. Higher profits boosted growing commercialization and industrial capitalism. Contemporary historians take a more capitalistic view of the influx of American riches. The inflationary pressures and higher profits that allowed the accrual of greater savings, which, requiring reinvestment, helped foster a fledgling form of early capitalism and industrialization. How responsible the American-inspired inflation was for industrial and commercial growth remains up to debate, as doubtless they would have been born without it, but some assistance from inflationary greasing of the gears of commerce is hard to dispute. Some confusion exists about the nature of the wealth extracted from the Americas by the Spanish armadas. The treasure looted or extracted from the Indians was only a small fraction of the total shipped over. That which wasn't lost to storms or brigands was primarily silver, and mined in the silver-rich areas of Mexico and Peru. Some of these mines continue to operate to this day. After the first few years, the majority of metals transported over was in fact silver. From 1530 until 1540, silver comprised 85% of the precious metals, and between 1560 and 1570, 97%. This continued to be the case until the richest and most easily mined ores were exhausted and exports declined in the 1630s. The coinage typically flowed to international ports to take advantage of lower prices. Much went on the expenses of war, especially to Spanish armies operating in France and the Low Countries of Belgium and Luxembourg. Max Weber estimated that as much as 70% of Spanish revenues and two-thirds of revenues of other European countries were so employed. A considerable sum of these monies landed in Amsterdam. The American treasure enhanced profits and stimulated industry, but also provided a new opportunity to those who saw money as a means to wealth. Out of necessity, silver coinage at the time contained copper to improve hardness and wear resistance. It was not difficult to add more copper to the coinage and thus dilute it, as had occurred in Roman times. While minting was a government license operation, it was often licensed to private mints, which reduced the amount of practical oversight that could occur. Counterfeiting techniques were also advancing rapidly. The lack of modern analytical techniques made it difficult to detect small variations in copper content. Just over a century after the first influx of American treasure in 1600, the merchants of Amsterdam were the recipients of a diverse range of foreign currencies, often with dubious levels of actual precious metal content. A manual issued by the Dutch Parliament listed 350 silver coins and 500 gold coins of foreign origin. With the Netherlands itself, 14 mints operated to turn out new coins. With so many different coins in circulation, it was easier than ever to profit from counterfeit and adulterated coins. To remedy this problem, the city of Amsterdam established the first public bank in 1609 to receive and refine worn and foreign coinage at reasonable cost. The value of said coinage was then provided as credit to the depositor in its books. Eventually, similar banks were established in other Dutch cities. The unification of city-states occurred in wider Europe, which led to a fall in unique coins in circulation, and minting methods improved, resulting in the decline of profit from monetary tampering. With the disappearance of monetary tampering emerged a new problem, that of trust in the banks themselves who held these deposits. For nearly a century after its founding, the Bank of Amsterdam operated honestly and with strict rectitude. Deposits were not loaned out and metal remained in storage. This changed in 1672 when the armies of Louis the Great approached Amsterdam and produced great alarm. There was a bank run, but finding the deposits intact, the depositors was reassured and no longer wanted their money. In time, this changed. The owners of the bank were well acquainted with the politicians of Amsterdam, who held shares in the infamous Dutch East India Company. It was common for the bank to provide short financial loans for the company in matters such as ship outfitting, and this was of little consequence while business was booming between 1600 and 1680. What made the Dutch East India Company so profitable in the 1600s was its near monopoly on exotic goods and spices. It enjoyed an exclusive trade arrangement with the country of Japan and had flourishing spice ports in the regions of Indonesia and a booming Chinese silk trade. The silk trade ended in 1670 due to conflict in China. The shogun restricted Japanese exports of silver and gold, which are in short supply, and the Third Anglo-Dutch Naval War disrupted VOC trade and caused spikes and shortages of now essential spices, which enticed competitors into the Indies, such as the French, Danish, and British East India Companies. With the bank continuing to fund a declining and debt-ridden East India Company, its deposits began to fall, and with it the reputation for trust and reliability. The bank limped on until 1819, when its affairs were fully wound up. With the decision to use deposits to shore up a failing commercial enterprise started the occurrence of a wider trend in banks to gamble customer deposits that has persisted ever since. Banking has existed at least since Roman times. Once the Roman Empire collapsed and the Dark Ages began, religious objection from both the Christian and Islamic faiths prevented the charging of interest on loans, also known as usury for Christians or riba for Muslims. With the onset of the Renaissance, pecuniary advantage led to the demise of religious scruple. Usury re-emerged as an essential tool for commerce and trade, which indeed it is. The decline and rebirth occurred in Italy, the latter at the hands of the Medicis of Venice, whose grandeur exceeded even the Rothschilds and J.P. Morgan, especially as they served as the financial support of the Vatican. It is the banking houses of Venice and Genoa that are recognized as the birthplace of modern banks. Similar to how deposits of precious metal were traded as de facto currency by the First Bank of Amsterdam, promissory banknotes were later introduced, which on presentation to the bank were redeemable for hard currency. Some notes would continue to be traded ad infinitum, which allowed the bank to provide loans to which they could reap profit as interest. The profit incentive increased the bank's tolerance for risk, which never caused any problems until a bank run occurred, which could ruin a bank overnight. The marvel of banks' ability to create money was suspended by a single silken thread of public trust. The sudden evaporation of deposits, once assumed to be good, resulted in a shortage of circulating currency and a sudden fall in prices. This fall in prices could pose an existential threat to those dealing in goods or with debentures to meet. Just as the creation of money could cause euphoria, so could the sudden evaporation of money cause panic and depression. With such magnificent profit at stake, banks began to abuse their ability to create more notes than deposits, and a period of cycles oscillating between boom and bust occurred. Typically, the cycle would repeat once the greater public had forgotten the last bust, with new financial sorcerers sprouting up to take advantage of the ignorant and amnesic masses. Advancing from the story of the First Bank of Amsterdam, we arrive at another tale of significance, that of John Law. Of Scottish descent, Law arrived in France in 1716 with dubious credentials. Having run through a considerable inheritance and in flight from an alleged death that occurred during a duel, he made his living for a time in France as a gambler, making use of his considerable propensity and mental calculation of odds. During one particular night of gambling, Law met with the French nobleman Duc de Saint-Simon, to whose memoirs we owe the story. Law relayed the idea of a new type of bank, one which took deposits not of gold but of land, issuing promissory notes for such deposits. The idea had met with tepid response in Scotland and Italy, but had found a receptive audience in France, which found itself under considerable financial strain from the expenditures of the recently deceased Louis the Great, or the 14th. The state of the French treasury at the time was particularly dismal, with expenditures double that of receipts. In addition to meeting Duc de Saint-Simon, Law also had the fortune of meeting the regent of Louis XV in a gambling den. Philip, Duc d'Orleans, was impressed by the financial prowess of Law and convinced Louis XV to issue a royal edict for Law to establish a land bank and issue notes with a capital of £250,000, which is about $50 million today. The principal borrower was the state, which used the notes to pay its expenses and creditors. The notes were declared legal tender for all payments. In these initial first few months, Law undeniably had done a good thing. The coinage of France at that time had a poor reputation owing to steady debasement through dilution, and was in short supply owing to the many wars of the recently deceased Louis XIV. The issuance of a new note backed by undilutable state land inspired confidence, increased the money supply, and boosted commerce and industry. The financial position of the state was relieved, and Law went on to open scores of branches across France. If Law had simply stopped there, he would have been remembered as a significant contributor to the history of banking, having established one of the first state-backed central banks. However, the regent, encouraged by the success of the first modest issuance of notes, requested the issuance of more. Law acquiesced, but recognized that more notes would require more deposits for backing. Returning to the idea of a land bank, Law decided to capitalize on the land recently acquired by France in Louisiana. Law founded the Mississippi Company in 1719 based on the thought that Mississippi held significant reserves of gold. The Mississippi Company was also given the rights to trade in the East Indies, the tobacco monopoly, and the right to mint. Stock of this conglomerate was listed on the public market, and the enthusiasm was so great that the stock multiplied many times in the short span of a few months. The earliest investors' modest sums of investment later became what we describe today as millionaires. All would have gone swimmingly if only the money raised by the sale of stock had been reinvested into the development of the Louisiana and surroundings. Instead, the funds were used to pay the expenses of the government of France. Effectively, Law was lending notes to the government or private borrowers, which were then used to pay for government expenses, instead of being used for colonial development and mineral exploration. This money cycled back to buy more stock, and the bubble was well underway. That the swamps of Louisiana were more appealing an investment than the government of France, and in fact, that the government was the object of investment and not Louisiana, would go unnoticed by all until 1720. By this time, Law had gained a reputation of great magnanimity and introduced some excellent social and economic reforms, including the relaxation of taxes and tariffs which served as a barrier to trade within France. February of 1720 saw the beginning of the end for Law's conglomerate. At the start of 1719, approximately 100 million livres in notes and stock were outstanding, which ballooned to 800 million by the end of 1719. A French nobleman, Prince de Conti, dissatisfied by the astronomical prices which Law's stock was reaching on the market, requested a great deal of notes to be converted into hard currency. Others had also begun to smell trouble and were busily converting stock into hard currency and shipping it out of the country. A stockbroker named Vermillet disguised himself as a peasant and used a cart to carry out 1 million livres worth of gold and silver into Belgium, hidden underneath a cover of straw and dung. In order to inspire confidence, Law impressed thousands of slum inhabitants with shovels and picks, and marched them off to the port to go and mine all the alleged gold hiding in the swamps of Louisiana. Soon the gold would be flooding back into the bank coffers to shore up the deposits of the banks. However, it was soon realized that this was a farce, when the mendicants were back in their slums and usual haunts. At this point, it became necessary to restrict the conversion of notes for hard currency. By the end of 1720, the streets of Paris were mobbed by the panicked masses who wanted hard currency for their notes and stock, but to no avail. The bubble had popped. The regent shipped Law off to Italy, where he died in comfortable poverty at the age of 57. As Law had shown between the years of 1716 and 1719, the miracle of money creation by a central bank could stimulate an asphyxiated economy and bring prosperity, if done with reasonable restraint. Long after the collapses of Law's conglomerate, the French public remained deeply suspicious of any form of currency that wasn't gold or silver. Thomas Jefferson shared in their skepticism with downright vitriol. He strongly condemned the issues of notes by banks. So too did John Adams, who maintained that every bank bill held in excess of hard deposits represented nothing, and is therefore a cheat upon somebody. But one fundamental principle of banking remained. Hard currency deposited at a bank could be used to make loans, the borrowers of which could use the income of their new investment to pay back the interest and provide mutual benefit for both lender and borrower. And it is herein that the problem of banking lies. How should precautions be made against the day that depositors come looking for their deposits, which, in the nature of banking, are simply not there? 3 major solutions exist for depositors to regularly withdraw their hard currency and keep the bankers cautious and meticulous in their lending practices. Another solution could be the stipulation of a fractional reserve, requirements by law, or for the government to provide some ultimate security on occasions when, thinking about the Bank of Amsterdam, the armies of Louis approach and the desire to refund deposits would resolve. The pioneering instrument of reform was the Bank of England. Of all institutions concerned with economics, none had for so long enjoyed such privilege. Akin to what St. Peter's is for faith, the Bank of England is to monetary policy. The pride of other nations' banks is their faithful imitation or original variations on the successful formula of the Bank of England. In recent times, central banking has become rather dull and pedestrian. Governments keep their central banks on the shortage of leashes and avoid research of even slightly controversial nature. That was until recently. At the time of writing in 1965, Galbraith's faith in the Federal Reserve and indeed the Bank of England itself was deserved, especially considering the former's role in Europe's rapid reconstruction after World War II. However, in the half-century that has since elapsed, it is likely his opinion would have changed in the wake of disastrous American monetary policy, the consequences of which are yet to be truly felt. The origins of the bank in England are not without tarnish, however. The founder, William Paterson, was a fellow countryman of the earlier John Law. His time in America in the late 1600s inspired a similar enthusiasm as Law towards the New World, that of a strategic colony in Panama. He proposed a similar scheme to Law as the Mississippi Company, enticing William of Orange, similarly broke as Louis XIV from wars with the same, to invest in a banking scheme and charter. Were the proposed capital 6 times the capital of Law's Bank of France, that of £1.2 million, to be raised from the wider public, this money was to be lent to William, who would guarantee a note issuance for the same amount. Interest would be earned on these loans and those of the government to allow for financing of the new colony. Ultimately, Paterson's plan was rejected and instead reworked to provide financing for the construction of England's new navy to rival that of France. England's finances were in a dismal state at that time owing to their loss to the French Navy in the 9 Years' War, along with their credit score, that was similarly bad. To inspire confidence, the Bank of England was to take over the finances of the English government and the only entity allowed to issue notes. The £1.2 million was fully subscribed in only 12 days, largely owing to the investment of William Phipps, who had successfully commandeered a Spanish galleon loaded with scores of tons of hard currency. The money lent to the government to finance the navy generated interest earning government bonds, to which notes were issued against, which could be lent again. The interest on the public debt was relatively high at 8%, but this was to be paid off in spades as the Navy later established British naval dominance in the latter part of the 1700s and 1800s in the global seas. Paterson went to Scotland where he found enthusiasm for his Panama colony scheme, later known as the Darien scheme. This enterprise would later turn disastrous owing to the hostile conditions and disease of the mosquito-ridden shores of Panama, and nearly all 1,200 settlers who went to Panama later died of disease, including Paterson's wife and child. He narrowly survived. The Bank of England enjoyed the privilege of exclusive note issuance for nearly 2 decades, with only minor competition from lesser banks and goldsmiths, who also operated a limited form of credit in the form of deposit notes. Then in 1720, the South Sea Company, similar to the East India Company but trading mainly in slaves, emerged as a strong competitor for the management of government debt. It bid strenuously and won against the Bank of England for this role, including underhand bribes to important parliamentary members. The South Seas Company never enjoyed the same financial success as the India Company, owing to the ongoing war against the Spanish at that time for control of key South American assets, which prevented the full implementation of lucrative slave trading to the New World. In addition, a great speculation occurred in the stock of the South Seas Company, which collapsed later in 1720 and inadvertently raised the reputation of the Bank of England far above that of the former. These two factors combined to disqualify the South Seas Company from ever managing the government debt. With its major competitor out of the arena, the Bank of England gradually emerged as the guardian of the money supply and financier of the government of England. Bank of England notes were readily exchanged for hard currency, and the sometimes dubious reputation of those of its competitors in rapid redemption regularly led to an overwhelming preference amongst the public for Bank of England notes over all others. By 1780, the Bank of England had become the sole source of paper money, with the smaller banks becoming places of safe deposit. When the private banks made loans, it was deposits, not note circulation, that expanded. These deposit notes later became known as cheques. When Lord George Gordon led his Catholic mobs through the streets of London in protest of the Catholic Relief Reform laws in 1780, the Bank of England was seen as a principal target as part of the establishment, and a siege ensued. Soldiers had to intervene, and the bank has been guarded by soldiers at night ever since. By the end of the 1700s, the Bank of England had eliminated the notes of its smaller London rivals. However, other central bank-related tasks still remained, chiefly that of regulating the monetary supply when facing external political pressures. In times of speculative or euphoric optimism, smaller banks were incentivized to expand their supply of depository notes, which would lead to the inflation of bubbles. The accompanying crash was not beneficial for public order. Furthermore, Britain's involvement in conflict with the American colonies in 1776 and later conflict with the resurgent French Empire under Napoleon produced further financial strain requiring judicious management. This financial strain led to bank runs in 1797 against the Bank of England, at which point redemption of hard currency was suspended. Notes once again became worthless and precious coins disappeared into hoards. A trove of Spanish gold pieces was retrieved from the bank vaults and stamped with the visage of George III, which led to an anti-establishment poet to write, "The bank, to make their Spanish dollars pass, stamped the head of a fool on the neck of an ass." The needs of the government continued to press, leading to a high rate of inflation from overissuance of loans for the war effort. Between 1797 and 1799, the price of wheat tripled. The value of uncoined gold rose substantially, leading to a House of Commons inquiry in 1810 as to whether the value of Bank of England notes had fallen or the price of gold had risen. Realizing that it was the overissuance of irredeemable notes, not the abundance of gold, the committee ruled negatively against the notes and required the Bank of England to once again make notes redeemable after 2 years. This led to a famous debate on the nature of money and its management in Parliament. The debate asked several key questions which remain today. Where does economic change originate? Does it begin with those responsible for the money supply, or does it originate with business activity? This is basically a question of chicken and egg. Does money supply influence the economy, or does money supply respond to the economy? The Bank of England argued that its loans and issuance of notes were in response to the flurry of activity from the war economy. The opposing side argued that the bank's lack of stringent control over currency supply had caused the inflationary decrease, that it was not the price of gold that had risen, but rather the depreciation in irredeemable paper notes. It is at this point that the bank realized the crucial role that interest had on the supply of credit, and therefore the overall currency supply. Being the lender of last resort that supplied reserves to other banks to allow lending, the Bank of England could control the availability of credit by raising or lowering interest rates on loans to the other banks. Increases in the interbank interest lending rates was a signal that other banks should slow their lending to dampen bubble formation and inflation. In case this signal was missed, the Bank of England could sell government securities in the open market and allow its other investments in the other banks to expire and be refunded. This reduced the supply of currency in other banks' reserves, which would increase the smaller banks' risks of insolvency if a run occurred. This was sufficient enough to control wider lending. New phrases were coined to describe this process, such as open market operations, the bank rate, and the rediscount rate. However, these are simply words to portray the Gnostic knowledge of bankers and economists supposedly beyond the reach of the ordinary man. The open market operations are simply the act of redeeming debt held by other banks and returning cash to the coffers of the Bank of England. Rediscount rates, or bank rates, is the rate at which other banks must borrow if their own reserves become insufficient for the credit they have loaned out to customers. Raising this rate also attracts foreign funds to the Bank of England. The final service of the bank, that of the lender of last resort, was recognized in 1825 to provide liquidity to banks facing bank runs. If the innovation of commercial banks belonging to the Italians and the invention of central banks to the English, the issuance of government paper money surely belongs to the Americans. There is some clear crossover between paper and government money. Notes loaned by the bank will retain their face value as long as it is not demonstrated by excessive redemptions that the real deposits are inadequate to meet the outstanding notes. As British experience showed during the tumult of the Napoleonic Wars, the notes did not lose all or even most of their value once redemption was suspended. It was believed by holders of the notes that once the war was won, the government would stop pressing the bank for more loans and redemption would be reinstated. This duly occurred. Comparing to the events of the Banque Royale of France nearly a century earlier, some key differences can be seen. The money being issued by the Bank of England was not to finance lavish government spending. It was being used to bolster the war economy and ensure the country itself would not be overrun by hostile foreign interests. This was a considerably better investment than either the government of France or the non-existent Louisiana swamp gold. Instead of the government lodging its wealth in a bank and using banknotes to pay its expenses, it could directly issue notes to those needing to be paid. As usual, the notes issued usually exceeded the deposits in government vaults. Regardless, purchasing power remained high while the notes were redeemable for hard currency. How much the notes depreciated once redemption was barred depended on the actual volume of notes issued in relation to the volume of goods and services to be purchased, and whether the future prospect of redemption remained. When there was an interest-bearing component to government notes, this further de-incentivized redemption, unless there was a wider doubt about the integrity of the government and its finances. The note would hold the majesty and integrity of the state behind it. The declaration that the notes were legal tender to pay creditors also made them attractive to debtors. The pioneering role of the American colonies was largely driven by the requirements of war, but also of basic commerce. The colonies were largely prevented by the mother country from sponsoring their own banks and notes. As taxes to the English state had to be paid in currency, this made the need for Bank of England notes all the more pressing. The general shortage of currency was an endemic problem that plagued the colonial economies. It has been generally thought that colonies were typically poor in precious metal deposits, and the mercantilist policy of the mother country insouciantly drained all precious metals and money back to the state in the form of taxes, and prevented it from leaving the state. The The colonists had to sell their produce in currencies that would allow the payment of taxes, and these currencies were always short. Sometimes the colonists would be required to trade produce for items from the Old World, likely at an unfavorable rate. That said, there are various other cities that had vast abundances of gold but no mines. Genoa, Venice, and Bruges come to mind. Therefore, it is also possible that the settlers would hoard hard currencies and pass on the lesser forms, leading to a shortage of currency. Regardless of the cause of shortage, this led to an instinct for monetary experiment in the American colonials, in addition to a growing miscontent with taxation, even in cases of representation. One of the first experiments involved use of Indian shells or wampum, which could be redeemed for pelts when trading with the Indians. However, it did not require much ingenuity to counterfeit these shells. The shells were ruled legal tender for small transactions in Massachusetts in 1641, thus making the Indians the prototypical central bankers of the American colonists. As the number of colonists increased, wampum fell out of use as the number of gain decreased from overhunting. The next item to feature as currency was tobacco, made legal tender in Virginia and other states in 1642, and continued to be legal tender for nearly 200 years, until the Constitution made money the sole concern of the government. Tobacco production, being an agricultural product, was merely limited by the will of the individual and land available for cultivation. It was also difficult to objectively determine the quality of tobacco received. Both of these weaknesses were exploited with exceptional readiness. A large harvest of tobacco would lead to inflation of prices, although the use of gold or silver to pay creditors was outlawed in 1642 by the growers. Tobacco was converted at a given rate of around 10 pence per sterling, depending on production, and demand was typically steady. This was effectively one of the first floating exchange rates, and just as coins could be sweated or chipped, good tobacco could be held and bad tobacco passed on. The solution was the introduction of tobacco grading certificates, which became full legal tender in 1727 in Virginia. Various other products were used similarly in other states for lesser periods, such as grain, whiskey, and even rice. The first issue of paper money was by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1690, occasioned by war. Sir William Phipps, of the same fame that helped fund the original Bank of England subscription, led an expedition in 1690 against the British state of Quebec. It was assumed that the loot from the fortress at Quebec would finance the expedition. However, the fortress did not fall. The budgets of the various colonies were minuscule, and there was no support for levying a tax to pay the defeated heroes. So notes were issued to the soldiers, promising an eventual payment in coin. The notes were to be eventually redeemed in coin and ruled legal tender for taxes. However, it soon occurred to the colonists that issuing more of these notes could be used as a form of covert tax, paid for in inflation by the public. By 1750, the value of these notes had fallen 1/10 of the original value. Similar events occurred in Carolina and Rhode Island, where notes were issued with even greater abandon and soon became worthless. Had only enough currency been issued to prevent deflation of falling prices, or even at a modest level of inflation, the issuance would have been largely beneficial. Surprisingly, restraint occurred in the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania. Prices were falling at the time, making it beneficial to hold onto currency as it rose in value, and such deflation suppressed trade enormously. This led to the issuance of paper money in 1723. The course of business with England improved, and a second issuance was made in 1729. Notes were put into circulation by using them to pay government expenses. Similar prudent issues in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland produced satisfactory results. Maryland then conducted a most engaging experiment. Notes were made available as loans to businessmen and farmers of repute, with great success and stimulation to the local economy. The monetary experiments of the colonies were spearheaded by a man of great repute, none other than Benjamin Franklin himself. In 1729, he published a paper titled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of Paper Currency. The colonial monetary experiments received considerable admonishment in the mother country. Parliamentarians alleged that they were proof of treasonous intent and corruption, describing them as a carnival of fraud and corruption. On this basis, Parliament forbade the issue of paper money in 1751. Strong protests ensued in the colonies. In 1766, Franklin himself made an appeal to the House of Commons in person, but to little effect. The ban became a serious source of miscontent and tension between Britain and the American colonies. The act of allowing banks in the colonies would threaten the Bank of England's monopoly on notes, and giving monetary independence would possibly lead to further overtures for governmental independence. Further attempts at banks in the colonies occurred, with authorization of banking institutions in New England, Virginia, and South Carolina. This was brought to an end once the Bubble Acts made in wake of the South Seas Company bankruptcy was declared to apply to the colonies. It was an outrageous exercise in ex post facto legislation. that is, legislation being used for a purpose other than that which was originally envisaged. The history of money reveals some elements of mass psychology. Having experience of inflation, people cherish stable prices. Once a long experience of stable prices is established, a tolerance to the risk of inflation occurs. In this way, older communities are less likely to accept monetary experiment than newer ones. Issuance of colonial notes did continue, however, for financing of military operations. It was by these notes that the American Revolution was predominantly financed. Between 1775 and 1779, two note issuances were made, one of $241 million and another for $209 million. Some aid is attributed to the financier Robert Morris, who raised $6 million from France and a few million from the Dutch and Spanish. The introduction of hundreds of millions of dollars for the war effort dwarfed the corresponding increases in trade, and heavy inflation ensued. Congress took steps to make the notes mandatory tender, but to little effect, and pairs of shoes rose as high as $5,000 per pair. Creditors hid from their debtors like hunted men. There was no alternative. Taxes were nearly impossible to levy in such a region of low population density with little existing fiscal infrastructure, not to talk of a strong distaste of taxation by the settlers themselves. Paper money was to feature heavily in financing later revolutions, including the Russian and French revolutions. It seems that what should be worthless squares of paper becomes imbued with a form of magical power. What should make it any different to strips of paper from a newspaper? The explanation is wholly secular, with no magic involved. Writers have distinguished between the three main types of currency. In the case of gold or silver coinage, value is derived from an inherent difficulty of resource input to extract, a long history of reliability and desirability, and usefulness in dentistry and adornment of status as jewelry. In the case of notes, redeemable and valuable assets such as land or coinage, such as fiat currency with no promise of exchange. When utilized successfully, all of these currencies shared something in common, that of scarcity. The problem of fiat currency was that without a redemption of limited valuable assets, there was no restriction on issuance. In the case of the currency of the French Revolution, the assignat, the scarcity which underpinned the value lay in the land that was to be freed from the aristocracy. It was not gold or silver which could be hidden or squirreled away. Land could not be hidden, and more could not be created than what already existed. The initial resource of land was not the aristocracy, but that of the church. It is estimated church land comprised 20% of all land in France at the time of the Revolution. The National Assembly declared all permanent taxes illegal in 1789, and the memory of John Law made the Frenchmen adverse to any issuance of interest-bearing notes, and foreign creditors refused to provide more assistance to the Revolution. In 1790, an issuance of 400 million livres was made to pay off the public debt. These assignat notes were to bear a 5% interest and be redeemed within 5 years in lands of the Church and Crown. Initially issued as bonds, they were soon redesignated as legal tender. Had the issuance stopped here, the assignat would have been celebrated as a remarkably interesting innovation. However, the needs of the Revolution and continuing conflict called for further issuance. The rapid sale of assignats and land they represented lowered the value of land across France, and many bargains were had by shrewd businessmen. By 1794, the value of assignats had halved, and soon redemption in lands was halted. In 1797, the Directory switched to a gold and silver standard, but by this time the revolution was an accomplished fact. Similar events occurred in Russia. By 1920, 85% of the state budget was being met with heavily depreciated paper money. As the revolution drew to a close, the Soviets realized the value of stable prices and hard money. Returning to the Americans, we can see that they learned their lessons of excess printing. The Constitution restricted issuance of currency to the federal government and expressly forbade the states to issue their own paper. The constitutional ban was lifted, like many restrictions, to the pressing needs of the 1812 war with Britain and its allies. Treasury notes were issued, some with interest of 5% in denominations small enough to be used as currency. However, they were not considered legal tender, in some small gesture to maintaining constitutional edict. During the Civil War, all pretense was dropped, however, and Salmon P. Chase asked the Congress to authorize repeated issuance of greenbacks. These were undoubtedly paper money. Inflation ensued, and the idea of a national bank emerged. Alexander Hamilton made an attempt to make good on these greenbacks, redeeming them at a few cents on the dollar. He then established the Hamilton Mint, which was to be the new legal tender. However, the standard of exchange to which gold and silver was set opened up an opportunity for small but sure profit via arbitrage. Gold was undervalued, and only silver made its way to the mint. At the time, Spanish silver dollars were still being traded in the nearby Spanish colonies, and these dollars were minted poorly relative to the American dollar, but weighing more in silver. The shiny modern American dollar was found to be of equal value in the colonies, and the American dollars were traded for the Spanish. These Spanish dollars were taken back to America and reminted for a small profit in silver per coin. Having driven gold out of circulation in the States, the US dollar drove the Spanish dollar out of circulation in the South. This was the Gresham effect again. Jefferson saw this occurring and put a halt to American minting of silver dollars in 1806. For the next 40 years, the states used currency of foreign origin in addition to pounds. It was here that the need for a bank arose. When considering the Bank of England, three key functions are exercised: the countering of the temptation of private banks to issue excess loans by requiring a fractional reserve requirement. It can then restrict the amount of cash in other banks' reserves by cashing in securities and holding the cash in its own reserves, and can serve as a lender of last resort in times of a bank run. It was the interest of the public to have stable money and prices and a lender of last resort. It was the pecuniary interests of the few private banks to have no restraint on lending and thus no restraint on profit or interest. As a side note, the audience should be reminded of the potential for profiteering that exists in the expansion and contraction of credit. Expansion of the monetary supply through lower interest rates inflates the value of real assets, which can be popped by sensible contraction of the supply and raising of the interest rates. If the credit has been provided for the purchase of hard assets such as land, the ensuing higher interest rates can compel default by debtors, wherein the land is reacquired by private banks below market value. By crashing the value of assets below market value, assets can be had at bargain prices. In 1791, the Bank of the United States was formed with an authorized capital of $10 million for a span of 20 years. $2 million was supplied by the federal government. Foreigners were allowed to hold shares, but not allowed to vote on the actions of the bank, allegedly. In total, 25,000 shares were offered, of which no individual could hold more than 1,000. When the books were opened for subscriptions, they were immediately purchased. Soon there was a sharp speculation to buy stock. Numerous thrifty participants managed to confine their subscription to a modest down payment, and the bank began operation with a mere $675,000 in hard cash. It is interesting to note that the list of shareholders is not available, and that heavy demand was experienced for shares, suggesting a strong motive for personal profit of the shareholders. Indeed, this was well understood by the Virginians, such as Jefferson, who say that the first bank is an instrument of usurping financial power from the lower and middle classes. In a speech, he expressed himself as follows: "I have been ever the enemy of the banks, not of those discounting for cash, but of those foisting their own paper into circulation and thus banishing our own cash. My zeal against these institutions was so warm and open at the establishment of the first bank that I was derided as a maniac by the tribe of bankmongerers who were seeking to filch from the public their swindling and barren gains. Shall we build an altar to the old paper money of the Revolution, which ruined individuals but saved the Republic, and burn on all the bank charters present and future, and their notes with them? For this would be to ruin both Republic and individuals. This cannot be done. The mania is too strong. It has seized by its delusions and corruptions all members of our government, general, special, and individual. The bank served somewhat successfully for the next 20 years in its 8 branches as a place of deposit for government funds, as an instrument of their transfer from one side of the country to the other, as a source of government and private credit. Notes were exchangeable for gold and silver, and well regarded by the public. Opposition still existed, however, for both the first bank and the other private banks. The less developed South opposed, and the Northeast favored the banks. When the charter expired for the first bank in 1810, the vote to renew was tied. A battle occurred to renew the charter between Jefferson, Madison, and the Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin. When the Senate tied, Vice President Clinton had his moment, rallied the opposite side, and defeated the charter renewal. In recent times, the post of Secretary of Treasury is a largely ceremonial position. Lyndon Johnson, in seeking to persuade an underling to take the post, warned him that on his refusal he would not tolerate anyone with brains on the job. 2 years later, the states entered the costly War of 1812 with the British and its allies. The cause of this war is still debated, varying from British seizure of American ships on the high seas, national pride, and other reasons. Whether it was linked with financial interests wanting renewal of the bank is yet to be proven beyond speculation, but that is exactly what happened in 1816. And this marks the end of part 1. In the second part, we'll be examining the Bank War, involving the very famous President Andrew Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States. As always, Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next part.